Good evening to some of you, good morning to others, and good afternoon to the rest. Welcome to the first panel of our 2022 Tech Arabia conference titled Social Justice and Sustainability. My name is Dana Ariqat, and I am the Director of Communications at the MIT Arab Alumni Association and VP of Impact at WISE in Jordan. I will be serving as the moderator today of this panel. As we start the conference today, and as Dr. Razaz has talked about inequality and environmental justice, it is critical that we take a moment to reflect on the many injustices happening around the world and the role that each of us can and need to play in order to shift the needle, if ever so slightly, in order to continue to make change. As collectively, we can begin to influence and promote and apply sustainability. Addressing social injustices is a prerequisite for achieving sustainability. And sustainability, in return, can help us on our road to social justice. While the world's challenges of injustices are many, we may have a long way ahead. We must work towards eliminating the conditions that systematically hinder people's capacity to meet their basic human needs in order to continue on a sustainable path for generations to come. Sustainability is most typically defined by three main pillars: economic, social, and environmental. Yet these pillars do not operate in silos, but are rather overlapped and interlinked. We are fortunate today to be joined by leaders from each of the sustainability main pillars: economic empowerment, education, and environmental sustainability, to hear about their work, challenges, intersections, and what, in their expert opinions, is the way forward. I will start this panel by introducing each speaker before allowing her or him to give their opening remarks, which will be around 5 minutes each, followed by a question that I will pose to the three panelists for a discussion, and then we will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Please feel free to post your questions throughout in the chat button. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, who is Hamdi Tabba, who is the co-founder and CEO of Abwab. Hamdi is the CEO of Abwab, which is a fast-growing edtech startup born out of the MENA region. It substitutes after-school tutoring by providing an online ecosystem that allows students to learn, solve, play, interact, and ask questions anytime and anywhere. Previously, he was the GM at Uber for MENA in the Levant and the GCC. And under his leadership, he grew the business in several multiples over 4 years and worked in the government to pass ride-sharing regulations in Jordan, the first of their kind across the region. Before that, he established Dukkan, pioneering organized retail at a neighborhood level. And he sold that business 6 years in after hitting an over $15 million in revenue. Hamdi has a master's degree from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's degree from King's College London. So without further ado, I would like to invite Hamdi to give his opening remark. If you can tell us about the work that you do, the challenges in brief, and how that contributes to moving forward towards a more sustainable world.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Dana, and good to meet everyone today on stage. Dana, before I start, it looks like the chat is not enabled it says only hosts can manage this channel. So if anyone wants to add any questions to the chat, I think Dana Boosi needs to fix that. I think it should be something in the settings. Again, very good to meet you all. As Dana mentioned, I'm one of the founders of Abwab. Abwab is an edtech startup that's operating in the MENA region. We were born because we believed that opportunity to receive high quality education in this part of the world is not equal. You can see that by the number of after school tutoring centers and number of students taking after school tutoring lessons across the region. If we look at the macroeconomics of it, there are around 160 million students all the way from Morocco to Pakistan. Estimated spend on after-school tutoring is around 25 to 30% out of household income. So parents are really just getting out of their way to get their kids to pass through school and set them up for life. And if you think of schools in remote areas and villages where probably access to a good teacher is not even there. Sometimes you could be in a village where um, you might miss on physics for an entire semester because they couldn't get access to a teacher. Um, that actually happens as a thing. So again, as Dana mentioned, what we're doing at Abwab is we're hyper localizing the experience into every country that we operate in. We launched in Jordan, and now we're present in Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Now, as a student, you come in and you find the entire curriculum that you're supposed to learn at school mapped out into a learning journey where you can learn concept-based lessons step by step. On top of learning, you're able to solve as many questions as you want and get instant feedback on your performance. You can compete on solving questions and collect points and check where you're ranking against other friends and peers and people you meet on the platform. And last but not least is our latest feature, which allows a student to immediately request support from a tutor instantly. So assuming you're solving a math question and you get stuck somewhere, you can snap a picture of the question, and within 15 seconds, at even 10 seconds now during finals, a student is matched live with a tutor to ask a question. It usually runs for like 4 or 5 minutes. You get the answer that you need and you leave. And this whole magic of getting a teacher or a tutor immediately pop out of the screen and help you with a question that you're stuck on is just fascinating students. If I always get the question of are we actually chasing the actual curriculum or are we changing the face of education? I think what we're trying to do at the moment is to get the best quality education possible to students given the current framework that is provided in a certain country. But long term, we always say that we want to be remembered in history as the great equalizers, which means we want to be able to level the playing field for any student coming out of this region as they go throughout their school years. And this could mean evolvement of how the product is. It means evolvement of the way students learn, evolvement of the curriculum, introduction of adaptive learning through AI and machine learning. And there's just so much to do. I think what we started off with is just building a product that allows students to enjoy learning, have fun doing it, compete, and just understand lessons in ways that are visual and interactive and engaging as much as possible. I think from the last point I would add, because I'd love to keep most of the conversation for the Q&A, that we also believe that we need to have as much access as possible to students, which is why we've positioned our product in a way where pricing is extremely affordable. Today, it's less than $30 a year, and I think on the long term, I don't think it will pass the $100 to $150 price point. Our aim is to scale it as much as possible, and even beyond that, we've launched an initiative to try to target the bottom part of the pyramid that don't even have access to technology, whether it being a tablet or a device or internet. And for that, we've collaborated with multiple NGOs. The main one is an LA-based foundation where students, refugee students and vulnerable students are able to access Abwab and learn from our entire platform from their own places, whether they live in a tent or in remote areas and villages. And this is an initiative that we just announced that we're going to scale and hopefully reach 1 million students by 2025 that would have otherwise been completely out of school because of their conditions. So this is us in a nutshell. We're extremely passionate about the mission. We believe that we will be able to unleash the potential of the upcoming generation in the region, and we're just excited to be part of this. So thank you, everyone, and good to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Hamdi. I mean, it's greatly wonderful that you began to talk about the next initiative that you're doing and you're targeting the bottom part of the populations, because one of the main goals of this panel is to look at how, in order to achieve sustainability, you need social justice, right? And in order to achieve social justice, you cannot look at interventions or areas individually. Intersectionality must take place. And so you already began this by talking about now economic empowerment, or addressing economic situations within even the education sector. So this is just something to keep in mind, to get to in the discussion after our two next speakers speak. So thank you so much. I will come back to you for this to this question later. And great. So our next speaker comes from the environment sector. She is a senior environmental advisor of UNDP Lebanon. Manal Msallam has been at the UNDP since 2010, serving as senior environmental advisor to the program, and supporting the Ministry of Environment in Lebanon on issues pertaining to environmental policy formulation and implementation. She has around 22 years of experience with the Lebanese public sector and international organizations in environmental legislation and planning, institutional strengthening, and resources mobilization. Manal also serves as a part-time faculty member at the Engineering School of St. Joseph University and the American University of Beirut since 2000 and 2009, respectively. She is the founder and president of Zahle School Aid Committee, an NGO registered in 2020 in Lebanon to support and savings for the education sector. Manal holds a BE in Civil and Environmental Engineering from AUB of 1998, an ME in Environmental and Water Quality Engineering from MIT of 1999. So she is a fellow alumni as well, and a PhD in Water Resources Engineering from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in 2008, as well as at the MIT Harold E. Lobdell 2017 Distinguished Service Award. So without further ado, I'll invite Manal on the stage to please tell us about your work and about the challenges you face.
Yes, hello everyone. Allow me first to start by thanking the MIT Arab Alumni Association for organizing this very important conference. I'm very happy to be with you to share my experience in relation to sustainability and more particularly from the environmental pillar. So as Dana was saying, I have been serving as a senior environmental advisor to the United Nations Development Program in Lebanon, trying to support the government of Lebanon in shifting towards a more sustainable development agenda, with all the challenges that come with that in a small country very much impacted by regional conflicts. And just to put things into perspective, to tell you that, for example, the annual cost of environmental degradation in Lebanon is about $2.3 billion a year, which is around 3 or 4% of the GDP in Lebanon back in 2018. And I must stress on that because, as you all know, since 2019, Lebanon has been witnessing a very severe financial and monetary crisis. So to better illustrate the type of work I have been doing and to try to enrich the discussion today on sustainability and social justice, I'm going to share with you 3 examples. The first one is what I consider to be a relatively successful one. The second one is what I refer to as successful on paper only. And the third one is like far from being a successful one. I mean, not to say a disastrous one, but I meant it to share with you like the 3 types of example to show you how challenging it is to work in the environment sector in developing countries. So if we start with the first example, and I'm going to try to share my screen to try to give you some example. I hope. I'm not sure if this is going to work. So I'm not sure if you can all see my screen. Okay, I mean, most likely because of the internet condition in the country. So anyway, by the time it loads, maybe I can start with the first example, which is a successful one. So this first, it's about environmental safeguards. I mean, thanks to like the collective effort of Ministry of Environment, Lebanon, and several donors, development partners, other government, civil society, and academia, we managed to finally have the environmental safeguards developed and adopted in Lebanon. And what I mean by environmental safeguards are all the legislation and regulations related to strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment, which are key tools to make sure that whatever strategies proposed by the government or projects proposed by public and private sector are taking into consideration the environment to make sure that we are trying to minimize environmental impact as much as possible. As I said, and which years in 2000 those which adopted meaning about this example of how this environmental start losing me. Okay, then it's okay. I'll continue without like the sharing the without sharing the any slides.
Okay, it seems there's been an issue with the internet connection from Lebanon. So while we resolve that, I would like to introduce our third speaker, and we'll get back to Manal after we've resolved her issue with the internet. So our next speaker actually comes from the economic empowerment sector, and she is the chief party at Encompass. Her name is Nermeen Murad Garlic, and she is the chief of party at Encompass LLC, which is managing a USAID funded activity of women's economic empowerment and leadership, WELA, which aims to improve the enabling environment around women's employment in the private sector in Jordan. Formerly, she was the chief of party at Takamul, a gender equality and female empowerment activity, the executive director of Information and Research Center at the King Hussein Foundation, and executive director of the Jordan Media Institute. Nermeen has also had a parallel career as a political editor and commentator with national, regional, and international newspapers focused on political and socioeconomic transformation in the Middle East region. Nermeen has a Master's of Arts in International Relations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Nermeen, on the stage to tell us about your work and the challenges you face in economic empowerment and sustainability.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the program Women's Empowerment, Employment, and Social Justice and Sustainability. Such a complex overlap between value-labeled concepts that help us look forward. So my program, I'll call it my program, it isn't really mine. But the program I'm running currently is called Women's Economic Empowerment and Leadership Activity, and it's focused on enabling environment around women's employment in the private sector. And the thinking behind this program that was designed before COVID-19 was that it will address impediments hindering women's economic participation in Jordan, which is at a very low rate of about 14%, one of the lowest in the world, to look at how we can encourage women, encourage employers, encourage the government, and encourage the community to all embrace the concept of women's employability, waged employability, and specifically in the private sector. The program wasn't awarded during COVID because of obvious delays in movement, and post-COVID, we were awarded the program, and the first question we needed to ask is the thinking that designed this program still relevant after COVID-19? And it wasn't. So this was the first challenge. We started this program in November, but I think many of the questions that we're asking ourselves as implementers are relevant to this conversation today. Is employment and employment of women the same as it was before COVID-19? We had indications before COVID-19 that the requirements for employment are changing. So much more after COVID-19. And so we had to address that question, and I will get back to it in a bit more detail. But one of the questions we asked ourselves is how can we achieve social justice, sustainability under conditions of the post-COVID and global economic stagnation? So it's a global question. It's not specific to Jordan, but it's a question we must ask and reflect on. The second question we needed to ask ourselves is what is the most efficient way to ensuring women's economic empowerment in Jordan, considering the framework of social justice and sustainability through employment. So again, it's my work. I need to look at employment categories, women categories, economic empowerment categories. What is social justice? What is sustainability? And then can you achieve women's economic empowerment in isolation or in absence of everyone else's economic empowerment, more specifically youth, socially and politically disadvantaged groups? Again, that's the framework I needed to look at. Is this something that I can address as a program by specifically focusing on women, or do we need to focus also on men, youth, disadvantaged other groups? And then the fourth question that we needed to ask ourselves is, are all parties, all decision makers on board with regards to these questions being a priority for a collective, holistic, and dedicated action? We needed to consider whether the government is on board, the administrative decision maker, both national and local government, whether the legislative decision makers are on board, the media, the opinion makers and influencers, the private sector itself, the economic decision makers. So are we all on the same page with regards to what's needed next? And reflect all of these questions on women. And this is where we needed to look a little bit more closely on Jordan's economic situation. So clearly economic growth was stagnating. Don't want to get into any conflict about this, but that's what the studies say. Youth unemployability is very high, 50% unemployment among youth, and so on. So it's interesting that Hamdi started with education, how relevant education was this, but this was a question we also needed to ask. was the traditional role model of learn, do, retire. Has it become an outdated model that's too rigid for us and for the current and future needs of the labor market? And that's a question that's not asked by me. I didn't articulate these questions. These are from global studies and global reflections. And the experts that were looking at the change of employment were saying that we've changed. We now need to learn and do, learn, repeat. We need to skill, upskill, reskill, and transfer in order to become relevant to the labor market. So within all of these restrictions, we also had to look at achieving justice. And this is where we're still in question. I'm interested in hearing what all the people attending this session think and our other speakers. But what we've decided to do in the program is to see women as part of the larger household. So it's not a women's responsibility to find work and to work and undertake domestic work and pay for childcare and find transportation. It's a household responsibility, it's a community's responsibility, and it's a government's responsibility. So we are changing the narrative on what it means for women to work, or why is it important for women to work, and reflecting that to say that it is important for the country, for the community, for the family that women work. And women, obviously, within that layers of analysis. The other thing we considered is, can we do everything to everyone? And obviously we can't. So we've decided to select sectors to become our pilot sectors. The first sector was tourism, because it's a sector that suffered during COVID but has potential for growth in the country. There is already the infrastructure for it. There are the institutions for building skills. There is a cultural problem with women being employed in the tourism sector, but this is one of the sort of tasks we take on. The other sector we're looking at is transportation sector. So we're also looking at whether a transportation sector from two sides. Are we looking at the transportation sector as an employer of women? So it's also interesting to reflect with Hamdi on whether women are employed in the transport sector, considering his experience with Uber. But also, it's an impediment to women's employment. So can women become involved in resolving the impediment that is restricting their access to work? And the third sector we're looking at is media and creative industries, because of the number of women who have been studying in universities and in the traditional linear educational pathways, and see whether we can reskill them and upskill them in order to become relevant to a more relevant with digital skills, green skills, and business skills. So this is where the program is going. And I'm sorry that I'm sort of giving more questions than answers, but I saw today as an opportunity to have this conversation with people who are looking at these similar questions and may be able to give us insight into what sort of regional relevant result coping mechanisms are governments putting forward, our private sector clusters coming forward with, and so on, to achieve social justice by achieving economic justice and giving access to women and youth and other disadvantaged groups in order to achieve a more sort of equal, I'm going to use the word equal now, opportunity. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Nermeen. It's fantastic to hear about all the work that you are doing in Jordan, especially with Jordan being, unfortunately, one of the countries with the lowest rate of female employment. Although the rates for the education of women is much higher. So, and I know there's legislative reasons, there are structural reasons, there are cultural reasons, there are multiple reasons that need to be addressed in order to look at why this remains to be such an issue in Jordan, and even more so with women in leadership positions. And yet at the same time, and there's a lot of great questions coming from the audience about the correlation between female education and climate change from Nadine Battar, which we'll get to after we hear from Manal, who is going to talk about the environmental work. And then we'll look at the way that these three actually come together and work together. So Manal, if I can invite you to make up your speech, your last spot. Due to the internet connection, I'm glad to have you back. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Dana, and apologies again. I'm going to keep my camera off to try to have my voice heard as much as possible. So I was saying that the state of environment in Lebanon is like the deterioration of natural resources in Lebanon is costing about $2.35 billion a year. So this is an indicator on how sad the situation is. And this gives you all an idea of how challenging it is to work in the environment sector in developing countries. To give you some examples about the type of work we do and where we succeeded and where we didn't, I'm going to share with you 3 examples. If we start on a positive note, thanks to the work we did as United Nations with the government of Lebanon and all other stakeholders in the country, and I'm stressing on all other stakeholders because this is the type of work where we need to involve everyone from government, private sector, civil society, academia, and others. We managed to have developed and adopted the environmental safeguards for the country. And we all know that without these regulations on strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment, there is no legal requirement to make sure that all proposed strategies, policies, projects take the environmental dimension into consideration and all potential negative impacts are properly attenuated before the strategy or the project are adopted and later implemented. So this work was done in early 2000 and it was adopted in 2012. So it took about 10 to 12 years to have these legislations adopted in Lebanon. And so this shows you that environmental lawmaking and environmental reform in general is very challenging in developing countries like Lebanon. If I share with you another example, the one I started by saying that it is successful on paper only. In 2006, Lebanon was hit by a very severe oil spill. We had 12,000 to 15,000 of heavy fuel oil discharged into the sea. A few months after, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning what happened and asking for a proper compensation to be paid for Lebanon. So with the work and the support of the United Nations, this compensation was calculated and estimated to be at around $856 million back in 2014. We are now in 2022, after 16 resolutions to date issued by the General Assembly. Till date, Lebanon didn't get the needed compensation from Israel, whereas, as we all know, we are going through a very difficult period in the country, and with this, and I'm emphasizing particularly on the social dimension. So this is an example on how the type of work we do can be successful on paper, but when it comes to implementation, nothing happens. And this is an indicator on how difficult it is to enforce international environmental legislation before talking about national environmental law. And the third and the final example I would like to end with is also one related to regional conflict, because when it comes to working in environment in developing countries, this is where it's very much affected by regional conflicts. In 2011, when the Syrian conflict started in Syria, As many of you know, Lebanon, hundreds of thousands of Syrian displaced came to Lebanon. And so Lebanon, as we speak, is hosting now more than 1 million displaced. This is the highest proportion per capita per area all over the world, in a country where the infrastructure, or the environmental infrastructure more specifically, was already very poor before this crisis. So in 2015, part of our work was to try to assess the environmental impacts of the Syrian displaced crisis on the country. And unlike other neighboring countries because Lebanon is not the only country hosting Syrian displaced, but the difference in Lebanon is that in many cases, we don't have like official settlements. We are talking more about informal tented settlements, which are positioned next to environmentally sensitive areas and next or on agricultural terrains, with all the food security implications that come with, and the direct threat on the environment. So these are the 3 examples I wanted to share to try to convey to you 3 messages, which I would like, to further discuss later if possible and if of interest to all. That 1, we cannot talk about social justice before or without talking about environmental protection. So environmental protection and conservation of natural resources is a prerequisite to social security, social justice. Sorry. Number 2, to achieve or to move forward with an environmental agenda in a developed country, we need political will and awareness on one hand, and we need on the other, on the side of the technical policymakers, perseverance, because things take a lot of time, and also continuous readiness to seize the opportunity whenever it comes. Last but not least, even with the political will and awareness and the technical readiness and perseverance, these are very important, but they are not enough. International support is a must in this part of the world to better enforce international environmental law and to make sure that the additional burden or social, environmental, and economic load caused by regional conflicts is fairly distributed to all countries. This is where I wish to end my intervention, and I'm, of course, open to questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Manal, for this. And actually, just to comment on your point about international support and environmental justice, while we have seen how little, unfortunately, international organizations and international courts of justice can actually do on other injustices, there does seem to be a commitment where it comes to environment and especially the ESG. So actually just 2 days ago, on May 7th, the SEC Climate and ESG Task Force issued its first enforcement action. And that task force was brought against a Brazilian company called Vale, alleging that it made false and misleading claims about safety of its dams. And misled local governments and communities. And this is the first kind of action that is ever taken by the SEC Climate and ESG Task Force. So we are seeing things happening and shifting in that regard. I would like to invite all of the speakers, Manal and Nermeen and Hamdi, for all of you to come on the stage, please, as right now we are going to open it to a panel discussion and also answer some of the questions from the audience. So, and if you can also turn your cameras on, for those who can, Manal, you don't have to be able to have the interaction. So I think one of the first things that really struck me from the work that the 3 of you do is each of you touched on an element from what we were talking about, the 3 pillars, but yet there's more. So I am really, I think it would be really interesting to hear about how does your work intersect with less obvious pillars or less obvious interventions? So how is education impacted by environmental justice? That is something we haven't looked at. You know, we've looked at education and economic empowerment, but Hamdi, for you, what kind of role does environmental justice play in education, and how do you address that? And you know, for Manal, it would be interesting to look at the specific impact of environment on women, and how that intersection takes place, especially in a place like Lebanon, where actually everybody is impacted by what's going on at almost certain level. Is there a difference in the impact that is gender-based, not necessarily just women, but gender-based? And for Nermeen, also would like to hear about how, you know, what we talked about earlier of how the women economic empowerment and economic equity is actually impacted again by also environment. It's a more obvious by education, but in the case of Jordan, it's interesting because women are highly educated, and yet there is a gap in the employment. So how do these things play together? And so we'll go backward, and we'll start with Nermeen now. To please, if you can go ahead and respond to that.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I want to talk a little bit, pick on your point about women being more highly educated. I think the trend we're seeing in employment globally is that there is more redundancies, but there is more gaps in more need for employees. So companies can't find the employees with the skills they have, although at the same time, more people are being made redundant and losing their jobs. And it is because of this lack of skill match. And one of the skills that is lacking and needs a lot of build-up is the environment and green skills. If we are going to create that link between the employability and economic empowerment, and specifically with women. I think with women, I just want to add that on climate change and environment, when programs started or interventions or activities in Jordan started to look at the relationship between women and the environment, they looked at women as the guardians of positive behavior in the environment. You know, they're in the house, they can look after the water resources, they can grow the tomatoes and look after the beets. And what we're trying to say is, yes, okay, by all means, we love our domestic role, but at the same time, also we need to see women as full citizens who are capable to contribute to the labor pool that the employers and the countries need for these jobs. So that link between women and climate change and gender in a positive sense, from an employment sense, it is to see them more and skill them more to be able to be contributing equally to that growing need. You've asked me whether how are women impacted by the environment? I think we were all impacted by the environment with COVID-19. In some ways, the whole poor political judgment on environment and the poor management of the environmental resources are contributors to what we found. Where women were more impacted than others is in situations like this, in situations of disaster as a result of climate change or of other environmental issues. Women bear the burden of the impact more often than not within households, and it is sort of it's a result of their assigned roles, so to speak. And I'm not necessarily pushing against these roles. These roles are equal to the roles of men in households in every way. But I think that it is a complex relationship, and I'm just saying that it should not be seen just as a relationship of where we are the guardians of good environmental behavior, and we can see it from a wider situation. I hope I answered your question on that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll take it to Hamdi also. I did pose a question for you about education and the environment, which is, less obvious. And there's also a question for you from the audience as well. So if you can go ahead and just respond to maybe what I posed and what Nermeen had talked about and where you see that link. And then we can come back to the question from the audience. It is a bit different. It is related, but a bit different. So
Yeah, sure. For some reason, I'm not able to read.
I'll read it for you. So no,
Okay.
don't worry about it.
Okay. Look, so from an education perspective, I mean, for us, it boils down to technology. When internet came out in the late 90s, or like at least became like mainstream in the late 90s, people started talking about internet being the great equalizer. Now with education through technology, we'd like to think of that as a great equalizer. Be it any challenges really, whether it's environmental, economic, social, regardless what the context is. The beauty of technology is that you can bring the highest quality education or educational experience to anyone to their fingertips. Really, if you're living in a rural area or a city or a town or a village, whether you've been displaced from the place that you've been living in. I think this is the beauty of it, and it also connects the world. So just to give some context, and I'm not sure how relevant it is, but it taps on the connectivity. We recently, I mean, part of the Abwab offering is being able to solve questions and compete directly with another student and collect points and seeing who does better. And for Ramadan, which just ended a couple of days ago, we ran a competition that was running regionally, like kind of globally, for students to compete with others across countries. So you were seeing students from rural areas in Egypt, for example, competing with a student in Baghdad, which probably they would have never connected with in a learning setting. But now they're able to connect with others in a community kind of thing. And just take them out of their, I'm going to call it bubble, but like take them out of their small bubble that they're stuck in. So to me, it's just that, and we're just seeing the beginning of it. I'm not sure if this answers your question, Dan, or if you have like something more specific you want me to tap onto.
Yeah.
I'll go to Nermeen's point, but Nermeen, you mentioned multiple things. First, you talked about women's employability and my experience at Uber. Then there was another one, I think. Which one was it? You're muted.
I was actually looking, and you sort of mentioned it when you said that you're moving towards sort of being a change maker in education, not just there. But this transition to change maker and skilling rather than doing the linear education,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we had a very similar panel at Harvard a couple of weeks ago where the same topic was brought up. I think anyone that's working in the education space would like to believe that we want to change the way people learn. You talked about, I can't remember the terms that you used, but like learning and then doing and then retiring, and how this needs to change. I think everyone in the education space loves to believe that we can do that, and I think we can. We've come to realize that this is not something that can happen overnight for multiple reasons. We are reaching hundreds of thousands and millions of students, and we believe that over the span of the next 5 to 10 years, we will be able to, first of all, know more about what students and how students learn than probably any other like government, because we're going to have like exact student behavior and what methods do they learn best in. Some students are visual learners, others are audio learners, some like to solve problems, etc. So just accumulate all of this data and all of these insights coupled with all of the academic minds that are working at Abwab. We believe that over time we will be able to change it, and positively affect governments and ministries of education on how the curriculum needs to be structured, because so far it's just been completely static for the past 100 years or so, as well as making learning a lifelong learning thing. And I think with technology, you can do that, which is your second point. Because today it's really like I go to school, there's like this structure that I need to learn through, and then I graduate and that's it. But a combination of changing the way you learn at school or like school age years, if you want, and then becoming a lifelong learner as you just grow and get into the workforce, if you want to call it workforce, and then join that. I think this is how things will move in the future, and inshallah, we're just very excited to be part of this change.
That's fantastic and really exciting stuff. I'll turn it over to Manal. Manal, I think the question from Nadine very much brings us into the same conversation, where Nadine Bitar from the audience asks, there's a strong correlation between women's education and climate change mitigation and cities' resilience. So are there any ideas for programs that could be scaled up in the region for this? I'm turning it to Manal first, but after Manal answers, please, Nermeen and Hamdi, if you want to pitch in and give your 2 cents, feel free.
Yes, absolutely. To answer Nadine's question, actually in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, now every country is being asked to assign a gender focal point. And so in Lebanon, as Ministry of Environment, I mean, there is a person being assigned to that. I mean, this highlights, I mean, the increasing importance of being like given to women in matters related to environment and to climate change. And the National Commission for Women in Lebanon is also very active on that front, in I mean, not only like enhancing the capacities or like doing specific programs to enhance the capacities of women in matter related to environment and to climate change, but also in making sure that every single strategy or plan being proposed in relation to climate change adaptation or mitigation is being like consulted with all stakeholders and women specifically. So I hope this like addresses Nadine's question. And to go back to the question asked earlier, Dana, I think, I mean, there is no difference in how we are impacted by the multiple environmental crises and climate change. I mean, women and men are equally impacted. But these crises are always an opportunity for everybody to change the way things are being done. And we felt this very much in Lebanon after the 3 crises that hit the country. And it's always an opportunity to further promote the women empowerment agenda. Over.
I do have to pose the question, and now are men and women or different various groups equally impacted? I'm the moderator, so I have to be neutral, but so I will pose it as a question to Nermeen and Hamdi. And what are the main similarities of groups that are most impacted when we're talking about vulnerable groups, right? What are they equally, is poverty and gender equally important? Or what do you see in your line of work where there are differences in various groups being impacted by whether lack of access to education, lack of economic opportunities, or lack of environmental protection?
You want to start? Go ahead.
Nermeen, you're muted.
Yes, I feel like I'm the spokeswoman for women, but I'm going to do it anyway. Disadvantaged groups or socially less able groups, economically and socially, have a dual disadvantage in times of crisis. When we talked about education and linear education, so people who have access to tertiary education are able to get to places, are understood to come from more affluent families. Hamdi quoted a number that I found very interesting about how much a household is spending on education and tutoring and so on, which is quite interesting. Women also, for example, if women work, if they want to work, I'm sorry I keep talking about employment just because I'm obsessed with it now, working in the program. But when women work now, we are immediately told there is childcare issues and there's transportation issues and so on. And what the household has decided is that if she works, she needs to pay for this. So if she gets childcare, she needs to pay for it. So if she needs transportation, she needs to pay. So they become responsible for their exit from their social disadvantage. Socially responsible, economically responsible. And this goes also to others. Somebody was quoting the other day, youth being invited to interviews for employment, but not being able to go because they couldn't pay for it. And so so if you're disadvantaged, nobody's helping you pay even to go and try and get a job. This is a simple day-to-day example. This is the lived reality of disadvantaged people. They're not really sort of very sexy words that describe wide concepts. It's actually daily living. And so when you're disadvantaged, you actually can't make it from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, and there is no social structure or government structure to support you to move forward in that. And there is discrimination also. So social constructs that discriminate against you and already believe that you should stay within your space and you shouldn't aim so high. So this is where the disadvantage is. If they are, I can understand where Manal is saying they're impacted equally. If it rains on both of us, But if you're poor, you don't have a raincoat, you don't have shoes, you don't have a house, you're probably living out, in uncomfortable situations. So this is the equality versus equity debate anyway in general, that you can't just give equally. You have to consider how much it takes to take you out of your disadvantage to a space where you are with an equal access and equal opportunity. In general, I hope that sort of answered you a little bit. Thank you.
I think, Dana, from my end, to just quickly tap on this, there are two groups which we see, which again, through technology, we're able to solve for that. The first is females, because in more conservative societies, you see parents asking females to stay at home instead of going and walking on foot to after school tutoring centers and just having to stay at home. And then if they can't afford a tutor, obviously they can't afford one-on-one because it's very expensive, but even if you can't afford a tutor to come with a group of 3 or 4 students, that learner or student ends up being prevented from getting the education she needs. I think the second group, which we're working more and more with, are refugee students that are obliged to take day jobs in the morning to be able to support their families. And there's this initiative which I talked about that we launched with the Children of War Foundation from LA and that we're scaling right now. Today we have 130 students, and we were with these children during Iftar the other day in Ramadan, and they were saying how, had it not been for Abwab, they couldn't have taken any sort of primary education even, because they have to work in the morning, 9 to 5, and then they come back home at 5 p.m. and they learn through Abwab at their own pace. And with that, they're able to substitute. Schools. So we've been really able to provide a life-changing experience for these students. So I would say these are the two groups for sure.
Great. Actually, this is your answer about this leads directly into the question that Ahmed Bassam has asked from the audience, where he said that throughout COVID-19, we saw that the online learning practice left the most vulnerable groups behind. And we know that people who did not have access to electricity, people who did not have access to the internet, people who did not know how to use tablets, people whose parents were out working so they could not monitor them at home. There's multiple reasons of why online learning left the most vulnerable groups behind. So he asked, how does Abwab ensure that it actually supports the avenues of challenges in online learning for the various vulnerable groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, we just hired someone, a very strong lady that has like 6 years of experience at the UNICEF that only did that. Her name's Maria. She just joined the team, and her complete role is just to lead the vertical of scaling this initiative, which we started with these 130 refugee students. Essentially, what we do is we collaborate with NGOs and donors and donor agencies, and we come up with a bundle that we provide to these students. And essentially, this bundle has a tablet or any device that a student can learn from, with data or like internet subscription that is paid upfront for the year, as well as the Abwab subscription. And with that, with the kit, and sometimes we even give them like some notebooks and stationery to use to learn with. And when a student gets that kit, they're actually able not to only supplement their learning, which is what we market ourselves to do, but actually they're able to substitute primary learning if they're completely out of school. And we've seen like a good amount of success through that initiative. Students that are through this initiative are improving by around 35% quarter over quarter in terms of academic performance. So we're also tracking that periodically. And I actually have an ask to everyone on this call. If you know anyone on both ends, if you know groups of vulnerable students or refugees that may need such a type of support, please let me know. I'm going to share my email right now on the chat, and you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. And on the other hand, if you also know donor agencies or NGOs that are ready and willing to collaborate on this sort of initiative, also please connect us or do reach out. We're really just chasing this as strong as we can.
Great. Thank you, Hamdi. And Hamdi, just so you know, tomorrow there is a free networking session. So if you look at the agenda, you can find it. And also there is a way to share your business cards on this platform. I'll have somebody share in the chat on how that's actually done. So here, if you just said, if you would like to share, whoops, where did it go? If you'd like to share your contact information with anyone here, click on the person's avatar's name in the participant listing and share contact info. And so you can also send messages as well. And like I mentioned, there's a networking session. We do have to wrap up in order for people to go to the next fireside chat. So if for like 30 seconds, starting with Manal, if you have any final words you'd like to say, you have exactly 30 seconds.
Perseverance. This is what I want to say. I mean, perseverance is the key word for moving the environmental agenda forward, particularly in developing countries.
Nermeen? You're on mute.
Yeah. So I wanted to also point to transgenerational justice, to look at youth more closely. I understand that we were working, I'm working on women's empowerment, and therefore that was the focus of the social justice that I want to talk about. But at the same time, youth in our region are really left behind, are really being left behind. And this would be, there is no sustainability without this generation moving forward.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much for this conversation.
Oh, no, thank you. Hamdi?
Yeah, I think the mission of leveling the playing field for the upcoming generation is bigger than all of us. We're all after it. So anyone that is willing to take part of this in any way or form or shape or possible, please reach out. As I mentioned, we want to be known in history as the great equalizers. So we're welcome for everyone to jump on board this mission. Udana and the entire MIT team, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Thank you, all of you, for being a part of this. I think this is a wonderful door for opening collaborations, whether it's across sectors, whether it's across countries, whether it's across even regions, where it comes to creating interventions and learning from each other about social justice intervention.